Caster and start here. And by the way, so it'll take a while after the recording is done for it to upload.
Sure.
There's an MP3 that's really quick, and so that's all I need. And then the WAV file, the higher quality, will continue to upload after that.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, I have insane internet here in Silicon Valley, so.
Oh, is that where you're at now?
Yeah, because I'm at Palmer West, so.
You're at Palmer West. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'll record kind of an intro, a little bio later.
Okay.
So let's just kind of get started chatting about you and you. I've kind of been, so let me start just kind of how I heard about you first from Melinda Novak and Savannah Shorts, because I was doing a soft little inquiry into what it would be like to do a radiology diploma at Western States, and just asking them about it. And how do you like the program? Are you able to do stuff outside of school? And they're like, no, you pretty much have to devote everything. I was like, well, but I heard about this guy, edits for Radiopedia, and he's doing all these other things, and he's doing the radiology program. They said he is not the norm. He is an exception. And they're talking about you, Matt. So
oh cool. Yeah.
What makes he such an exception?
I don't know. I think, all things with learning, the more you can, cross neurons and kind of bridge different interests, you kind of just build the complexity that you can pull from to access knowledge. So I try and integrate all of my hobbies when I became a radiology resident, because I knew I wouldn't be successful if I kept all of my hobbies, because I have a lot of them. So I was into photography before, so that was my artistic outlet. And I kind of just transitioned that into doing more like medical illustration type things. And that kind of brought me to Radiopedia, because I uploaded a couple diagrams. The editor was like, hey, kind of seem like you know what you're doing. We like your work. Do you want to be part of our team? And that, in those days, Radiopedia was quite small. Well, I shouldn't say quite small, but it's a lot smaller than it is now. And so I've just been with them ever since. They're a great group of people. And that actually, I think, helped me more than being a distraction, because now I had mentors, all over the world who are experts in their area, like, that I otherwise would have been inaccessible to me, like neuroradiology and abdominal radiology and stuff, because we're kind of stuck in MSK and in chiropractic, which is great. But in a radiology residency, you're responsible for all those other things, and to become, good at them, it's good to have, to be able to pull from that expertise that I was able to from all of the other editors.
So when you were a kid, what did you want to be when you grew up?
When I was much younger, I wanted to be a bionic surgeon. I thought that was really appealing to me. That's what some survey I took when I was like 10 years old told me I should be. So I just kind of had my mind on that.
That wouldn't be the Myers-Briggs. They don't go into that detail.
No, I'm not sure what it was, but there was some program that everyone had to take, and it gave you like a list of things. And, that was the one that stood out most to me, because it like involved travel and had made a lot of money, and it was like, healthcare oriented and stuff. And I was kind of always a little bit interested in healthcare. My mom worked at the hospital as an administrator. But she's the closest thing in my family to someone in healthcare.
Okay. So what is a bionic surgeon?
To be honest, now that I'm looking back on it, I don't think I ever really knew. I think they do a lot of like implant type of stuff. So kind of like more difficult long surgeries where you're dealing with kind of weird anatomy and implanting devices and whatnot. But I think the main thing was that I wanted to be like I wanted to be a physician in any case. I think the survey, when I took it, it gave me that type of physician over others, just because of the long hours and travel, because I'm kind of drawn to those type of career paths, or I was previously. But then as I got older, of course, I became more interested in like work-life balance and whatnot. So
yeah.
So kind of chiropractic really made that, I don't know, that's kind of a benefit of being chiropractic, isn't it? That you get to help people who want to be helped, not people who are dying. And that also comes with better hours and whatnot.
You said your mom was in healthcare. What other influences did you have when you're growing up to get involved in healthcare?
Well, so that was probably it, actually. I don't even know if that was a major influence. I think I was just always kind of drawn to healthcare, and I'm not entirely sure why. When I was younger, my grandpa lived with us in hospice for a while, and I think that kind of pushed me a little bit, because we had to care for him a lot, and he had some mistakes happened when he had gone to ER and stuff. And I think that maybe it was a kind of hidden source of frustration in my youth because I respected him and liked him a lot, as most people do with their grandparents. And and actually shortly after he died, I began working at the hospital as a certified nursing assistant. I took some college courses when I was young and got that certification. So I started working actually in a hospital when I was 15 years old. So I've been in healthcare for a while.
Wow. So were you a candy striper, as they call it, or were you actually working in a paid position?
Yeah, I was working in a paid position. So yeah, working as 15 years old as a certified nursing assistant is a pretty sweet gig for salary wise, because I was making about double what all of my other friends were working minimum wage jobs.
Were you working, or were you in school full time as well? Were you still in high school, or
I was still in high school. Yeah, so I would be in school all day, and then I would be in sports usually until 5 or 6 whenever sports ended, and then I would go to the hospital, and I would usually work the second half of the PM shift. And I think when you're 15, they cut you off at like 9 o'clock or something, so then I would pass off early to the next person or someone to transition until night shift came on. So they actually made a lot of accommodations to have me there, and I don't know why they did that. I think it must have just been to make my mom happy, which I guess shows how much your people who you know matters.
Yeah, it's true.
But yeah, like we were talking about before the podcast started, it's kind of the benefit of being in a small town. People are willing to bend over backwards to make people happy.
Yeah. So where did you grow up?
A small town called Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. It's kind of near the bigger towns around that people might be more familiar with because they have universities, are Stevens Point, Wisconsin, and Wausau, Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely heard of it.
Yeah, and the capital's Madison, so it's about an hour and a half north of there.
Okay. Very cool. And what led you then to choose chiropractic out of all of the other options in the healthcare field?
Yeah, so when I was in college and still working as a nurse assistant, and I would go back on the weekends and work, I would always chat with the physicians that I interacted with and kind of get their opinion on and career advice, and what specialty should I do, what should I be focusing on in college, and all of these things. And all of them actually recommended other professions than their own. So like the primary care would be like, oh, we'll become a specialty because we have to know all of these, a little bit about everything, versus knowing a lot about one thing is a lot easier. And then all the specialists are like, oh yeah, well, I work all these terrible long hours and whatnot. And then, I've been going to a chiropractor since as young as I can remember. My mom was taking us as a kid and all throughout sports and growing up. And so I talked to him and he's like, yeah, I love my job. You should become a chiropractor. And I was like, wow, like you're the first person who was like confidently like, my job is the best job that I could imagine and you should do it. And I was like, oh, well, I'd never really considered that. And that's healthcare. And I like taking care of people and I like knowing about the human body. So I'll give it a go. And yeah, so that I applied to chiropractic school as a senior in college, I think, or no, maybe a junior in college, and got accepted. And yeah, I was really excited and I haven't regretted it since.
Great. And where did you go to undergrad?
The University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire.
Mm-hmm. And what was your major there?
I studied biology and chemistry, so those were that was my degree.
Yeah, that's what I started with in my undergrad. I didn't know, I knew I wanted to do chiropractic, but I didn't know what the undergrad should be because there's no real guidance.
Right. Yeah. Not a super popular area in undergrad institutions.
Yeah. So actually, I think I started in biochem, which was a huge mistake, but I never actually took any classes that first year that were related to the major.
Okay. So what did you end up studying then?
Well, I started in information technology.
Okay.
Because I was always into technology.
Explains the podcast.
Yeah, it does. And realized that I hated programming. At least at the time, I thought I was really bad at it. I just couldn't understand it. I look back now and I was getting A's and B's in all of those classes, which confuses me now. And so then I switched to exercise science.
Okay.
Which is pretty common. It's also, I think it's the equivalent of kinesiology in a lot of universities.
Yeah.
But had to then come back around and take biochem and organic chem.
Mm-hmm.
Those are
I made the mistake of really liking organic chemistry because I had a really good teacher, and so I took some of the graduate level courses in organic chemistry, which it turns out weren't nearly as fun as the regular organic chemistry that you take. So I spent a lot of my senior year of college being extremely stressed out by those courses.
Oh, they were so intense. And I often wonder why for chiropractic we need to take organic chemistry. So I ended up taking a couple of general chemistry, organic chemistry, and then it was kind of a blend, a intro to bioorganic chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And when I took that class, I was like, this is what everybody should be taking. This is exactly what we need to know, because it's so much more focused on the physiology, whereas organic seems to have more application to pharmaceuticals and other such type.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. I'm glad I took it. I think understanding a lot that I know about pharmaceuticals and like the purity of samples and the chirality and how it's difficult to get those things kind of explains the cost of some pharmaceuticals and their different interactions between generics and brand names and stuff. So it's definitely not knowledge I use on a daily basis, but I definitely don't regret having that background.
Yeah, after reviewing it a few times, it really became intriguing to me. The one thing I just really absolutely hated was the NMR doing the
Oh yeah, yeah.
reading
Basically MRI,
those.
right? Yeah.
I guess I don't understand either of them well enough to know how similar they are, but I guess that makes sense. Yeah, but to look at those little peaks and to try to decipher what is in there was a huge struggle for me.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. I think everyone. I remember having a few cold sweats on exams, trying to make sure I was figuring out what was going on in those samples.
So then, which chiropractic school did you choose?
So I chose Northwestern Health Sciences University. I would have actually moved further away than that was the closest to me at the time, which was part of the draw, which I think is for a lot of people is just convenience. But
Absolutely, yeah.
Their mission definitely fit with what I thought was important. I wanted to make sure that I was at an institution that kind of represented my values, and their website seemed to validate my thoughts. And so I did a campus visit and stuff, and everything seemed to fit. So I was happy I went there.
What were some of those things that appealed to you? You said you kind of just reading their website was enough to see that it matched your ideals or your goals. What were some of those
They
things?
definitely made like a concerted effort to say that they definitely valued like evidence-based medicine, but then also balancing, the art and philosophy of chiropractic. And so kind of making sure I was getting the full experience of knowing what chiropractic is all about, but then also integrating that in kind of with the 21st century evidence-based medicine model, which I think is critical for our advancement as a profession and me as a person. So those were kind of the things that I was looking for to be priorities of the institution that I was going to choose.
At what point did radiology become an option? I'm really trying hard to avoid the pun. When did it show up on your radar?
Yeah, no, I'm not really sure. I think about that a lot because people ask me, and I remember as my very first radiology course, them mentioning like a residency, and at that point in time, and even almost up until the point that I was applying for residencies, I didn't even really understand what a residency was. Like it's kind of a weird term, isn't it? Like you think of like a resident as like a person who lives in a building.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, I looked into it initially, and I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like that's a lot of extra training. What does that get you? Like we're being taught radiology now. And then, as you go through those courses and you go through chiropractic school, my experience was that the radiologists seemed to be the people who were the most confident and in their knowledge and most confident in their deficiencies in knowledge. And I think that's equally as important as knowing what you don't know, or at least having an awareness that you don't know a lot. And so that kind of like objective look at your own mind, I think was kind of what it was appealing to me. And so as we went through the courses, I would say I was maybe a little above average at it. There's definitely people like who performed better in the courses than I did. And then kind of thinking of it from a tech perspective, I'm kind of a techie type person too. That drew interest in me. And then as I got into photography, I'm kind of a visual person. That appealed to me. And then the thought of being able to, because everything's digital now, being able to take my computer with me anywhere in the world that I want to work and being able to perform my job independent of my location was a huge draw. And so kind of looking at that work-life balance issue with the kind of more academic side of things, it just seemed like the right blend. But then, of course, I had to make the decision to give up the clinical care I was doing, which wasn't a small decision either, because I loved interacting with and helping patients and having that kind of physical connection. So it definitely was a trade-off.
Yeah, that convergence of all those different interests was really what drew me to considering it as well, and it just hasn't fit into my current life plans.
Right.
But the photography, the technology, and I guess in some ways the radiology is a little more cut and dried than seeing the whole patient in front of you.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
personally, that appeals to me. I don't do very well with a lot of ambiguity. I work to get better at that. But to look at a picture and say, "This is what I see,"
Hmm.
I do really like that. And as you mentioned, the digital. I've been a big fan of the tiny house movement, and
Sure.
partway through school, I was kind of envisioning myself with a little tiny house driving around Europe with a computer and
Yeah.
a good display, being able to read images from wherever I'm at, up in the mountains or
Hmm.
traveling the world. So um, that definitely appeals. How much of a reality is that now? I mean, you've set up your consulting uh, company, your digital
Hmm.
X-ray reading.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a pretty big reality. The thing that is a little bit difficult with it is that you do actually need a diagnostic display to read images, which it turns out are not that small or lightweight. And so like I'll look at images on my laptop and stuff, but I won't generate a formal report that I'm putting my
Hmm.
stamp of approval on unless I'm looking at a diagnostic display, because uh, the contrast characteristics and brightness and all these different things actually make a massive difference. The students daily, when I'm reading off with them, they're come to my office and we read off the X-rays that they wrote reports on, and they're looking at my monitors and they're like, "Wow, like I couldn't see any of this stuff on the monitors in the lab." And so like they noticed just going from one to the next that like you can see so much more. And so in order when you're responsible for identifying pathology in those images, you need to have that type of stuff. And so that makes you a little less portable then, because now like if I want to jet off to the weekend in Hawaii and I know I have to read some cases, I can't just like bring those monitors with me.
Hmm.
So
And so that's not just resolution, but that also has to do with other technical aspects like contrast.
yeah, definitely. Yeah. So like when you go to buy a diagnostic display, like the minimum you're going to spend is over $1,000 for one display.
Hmm.
And part of that is because they have different quality control standards, but they're also much brighter. So like my consumer grade displays, I think, go up to like a standard consumer grade display maybe goes up to 300 lumens, but a diagnostic display often goes up to 700 or 900 lumens, and that extra brightness allows them to display more shades of gray and things like that. So and then be able to identify things in darker areas without window leveling, because people think they can window level to see all of the different darknesses on the image, but that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been curious with the consumer technology that's becoming so much more advanced. I have a big 27-inch iMac in front of me now. The new version is a 5K display. There's talk
Wow.
about them coming out with an 8K display. So the resolution is there, but that
Hmm.
still wouldn't be enough to be diagnostic quality.
Right. Yeah. I mean, certainly, like there's a spectrum, right? So like those are probably pretty good, and maybe approaching like where you could read an image and make a confident diagnosis.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, but having the quality control that's mandated by like medical grade displays is something um, I think is important. I definitely I look at images on consumer grade displays a lot, and like so like more professional ones. So like I have some Dell like graphic design monitors that I spent a lot of money on, but definitely not nearly as much as a medical grade display, and those I think are probably pretty good. But they're a little bit brighter too then. So
Hmm.
I'm not sure what the specifications on Mac are, but yeah, putting them side by side would definitely be the test. I read one article where they had radiologists looking at cases on different images, and some of them actually preferred looking at them on the cheaper images because they were so much more contrasty, because
Hmm.
consumer grade displays kind of force black, right? So like when you're watching a movie, like
Right.
you want the black areas to be black and whatnot. And so but you lose the detail then once you force those shades and you force that contrast with like the pixel pitch and whatnot. So even though the images look more contrasty, maybe like a fracture stands out, then the more subtle things maybe don't stand out. So there's a trade-off.
Okay. It's interesting to me though that we then sit down for our board exams and either have 30 to 40-year-old images,
Mhm.
films up in front of us, or we sit in front of, the budget mass-produced Dell computers to take those exams.
Yeah, it's funny because the hard copy X-rays, those like the old analog films are the reference, are the standard for comparison. So like the best displays are trying to like make the images look as good as hard copy X-rays did.
Hmm.
So the difference then is that the acquisition of the image is different. So like when you're taking a digital image, you have better you have a lot more data that you can manipulate to create an image that looks different than you would get with an analog. So there's that side of it. And so a lot of people prefer looking at digital images because we can maintain contrast in like soft tissues and bone versus an analog, right? It's all purely density based, and our film contrast curve can't necessarily expose soft tissues as well as bone equally, whereas
Mhm.
we can do that in digital. So for that reason, digital is a lot better. But for the actual like display of the image, the hard copy film is still actually pretty amazing.
Yeah, the resolution is, I guess, nearly infinite,
Yeah, yeah, it's
depending on how
pretty
you
good.
measure that. Now, everything's going digital now. I see more and more people on Facebook, chiropractors, saying they're getting rid of their analog equipment.
Hmm.
Most of them are just getting rid of X-ray in the office, just altogether, and sending
Hmm.
them out to
Yeah, it's expensive to maintain that equipment.
yeah. Uh, and one of the benefits that is touted is that digital imaging reduces exposure to radiation. But there have been some questions as to whether or how that is true, I guess. So if you take a single image on a fully digital setup,
Hmm.
is that more or less radiation that you're going to get?
Well, it depends. So digital systems can recover images with much less radiation exposure, but they still definitely need need some. And so it you can get away with doing a lot less, but there is diminishing returns. So the quantum model in the image, the graininess of the image will increase with lower radiation doses. So you have to determine like at what level do you say too much graininess, like the graininess is inhibiting the image. But on the whole, digital imaging has substantially decreased our exposure to radiation per exam. So that's definitely true. But that being said, not all systems are created equal. So some film receptor systems that are digital, or sorry, X-ray receptor systems that are digital, still require about the same amount of radiation as an analog X-ray. So it's a very heterogeneous kind of environment out there for as anyone who's purchased digital equipment knows. There's so many options, and so some are better than others, of course, and a lot of that's tied to how much you're willing to spend. So on the whole, though, I would say that it's going digital has resulted in a dramatic decrease in radiation exposure per image.
So because it's more forgiving, maybe each image is not less radiation, but you don't have to take as many. You don't have to repeat a study, perhaps.
Yeah, so yeah, if you're on an analog and you over or underexpose, right, that may limit the image to the point you have to do a retake. So yeah, retakes are substantially less with digital, but
Mhm.
then also, and so that's a portion of it. But even any individual shot, you can use lower MAS on average than you can get away with on an analog system because that's going to make the image underexposed on an analog. But because the contrast curve for most digital systems is linear instead of like an S-shaped curve, you
Mhm.
can manipulate the data anywhere along that point, regardless of how over or underexposed it is. Which is why you can shoot a lumbar like film on the same as like an extremity. There's not like an extremity and spine and chest cassettes are not all different because there's just we have a linear contrast curve.
This brings up the principle that we're always taught is the Elara principle, as low as reasonably acceptable, I think,
Yep,
and
or achievable.
we're
Yeah.
or achievable. Thank you. We're always attempting to reduce the amount of radiation exposure that our patients are given. But a paper came out a couple years ago that I read that really intrigued me. And again, I probably don't understand it well enough, but it was the idea of the birth of the illegitimate linear no threshold model, and they basically went through the history, the story of how this concern over radiation exposure with the X-rays came about. And the conclusion was that we don't really need to be as concerned as we think we do. In that, and the author's opinion was that they may actually be causing more harm uh, than intended by withholding some exposure to radiation. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. I don't know if you've had a chance to read that paper, if it came across
Yeah,
you.
I read that paper, and actually, since then, there's been some back and forth in letters to the editor, of course, because it stirred up a lot of controversy. So some other prominent medical physicists wrote letters criticizing that paper.
Interesting.
Yeah, and then they responded criticizing those people, and their thoughts.
So there's been some back and forth, which I think is good.
Yeah. So yeah, that's good, because anytime we open up those kind of discussions that are controversial and maybe the data isn't necessarily as sound as we thought it was, that stimulates thought and potentially can lead to policy change. So my opinion on that paper is that even if that's true, right? And so I think their assertion was that a lot of this data we got for this linear model was from nuclear bomb survivors. And so they were at higher exposures. So once you get into these lower exposure ranges, our capacity to heal the damage that's caused by the X-rays is enough that it can offset those. So it's not necessarily linear at low exposures. And potentially even their assertion was that some of the data, not all of it, but some of the data said that actually there was a decreased risk. So you actually had a benefit from getting a small amount of radiation.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been some animal models which showed that, like there was a couple experiments done on mice where they gave them very low levels of radiation, and those mice live longer.
Right.
And that's called hormesis. But as from a public policy standpoint, when you're ionizing someone, you can't really establish a safe threshold because there isn't a clear threshold. So when there's not a clear threshold, then no threshold is really safe. So I think even if they're right, even if the small amounts of radiation don't harm us or even make us better, perhaps that's not a good public health policy, because then where do you establish your cutoff? So like how many CT exams does it take to pass that threshold or something? So, but then their other argument was that, okay, well, our fear of these imaging modalities that involve ionizing radiation potentially prevent people from getting the diagnosis that they need. And so that's something to consider as well. If I were going to play devil's advocate, then I would say, well, yeah, but also when you perform more imaging studies on people, you lead to more unnecessary follow-up. So if we're not being very objective and withholding unneeded exams, then we're potentially performing exams. Sorry, my speaker's going. Performing exams that are going to lead to unnecessary follow-up. So if I have an incidental finding, for example, that I'm not necessarily sure what it is, potentially is something bad, then I have to order additional imaging, and that may not benefit the patient. And especially if that initial exam wasn't warranted, then that's something that's actually harming the patient. And the other side of that argument too is that people often will attribute findings on X-rays to their symptoms, and there's not a good correlation between symptomatology and imaging appearances. And I think one of the papers you sent me and talked about that is that there's this thing called diagnosis labeling, where people see a finding and they say, okay, that's the cause of my pain, and then that pushes them towards surgery or some other type of unnecessary intervention.
Right. So this is something that's been, I've seen multiple articles come out. I think the one I sent, or one I'm looking at now, is from the British Medical Journal. And the title is "It's Time to Stop Causing Harm with Inappropriate Imaging for Low Back Pain." And this applies so much to chiropractic because it was the practice of so many chiropractors, and some still, to image every patient that would walk in their door. But it's not just chiropractors. I did a stint in the VA hospital, and the patients could not come to the chiropractor unless they had an X-ray image within the past 2 years of their spine. And you can definitely see that. On the one hand, it was really awesome for me as a student to be able to look at so many images, because I don't think we get enough opportunity to do that. But I definitely saw patients come in who would say, oh yeah, oh gosh, yeah, my back looks bad. I'm like, no, actually, it looks pretty normal. You're just looking at it and you think it looks bad because that explains things.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And it's definitely like being a radiologist, like it's a kind of a persistent frustration of mine that I have to navigate this situation where I have a finding that I'm not necessarily sure what to do with. Maybe it's kind of like a finding that I don't know if it's real or if it's an artifact, or maybe it's a real finding that I don't know if it's clinically significant because I don't have the patient in front of me and all of these things. And then, so like, what do I do with it? So I have to choose what I want to say about it. So like, what do I think this is? What's my differential? But then I also have to, if my differential includes something that's bad, then I have to recommend additional imaging. And that doesn't always necessarily correlate with the patient presentation. So like, I may make a recommendation that seems inappropriate to the clinician because I just don't have that the feedback from the patient. And so then I often can figure that out and realize that like, well, if I just had the patient here, I could just ask him this thing. So then I just have to say like clinical correlation is recommended in my report. But that isn't always necessarily clear either. Then so like sometimes I'll say like clinical correlation is recommended for this finding, but if the person reading that isn't necessarily sure what those differentials are or what they mean for the patient, then they're like, well, what do you mean? Like what do you mean clinically correlate? Like, how am I supposed to, like, it's not clear, So, right. And then it's like, but then I don't, so like, then I have to decide in my report, like how much do I say about how to clinically correlate this? Because I definitely don't want to be patronizing. Like these are smart, educated people who are good at their job. And I don't want to like tell them like, oh, well, you should be doing this when they know that, because then I just kind of look like arrogant or something. So it's always just trying to strike the balance between being as helpful as possible without missing something or just omitting something that potentially is significant, but then also not being overbearing and forcing people's hand. Like if I make like a recommendation that like to get this imaging and then they don't get the imaging and something bad happens, well, what does that mean for the clinician? Then they look bad or something. But then again, if I recommend imaging and then they don't do it, or they're kind of forced to do it then because they're like, well, if I miss something and I don't get this imaging, then I'm kind of liable because the radiologist said I should get this imaging. So it's it's kind of a scary world out there is what it comes down to, I guess.
It really is a tough balance because I think you're right that a lot of chiropractors are very confident. They just need that, that qualified chiropractic radiologist to confirm their suspicions. But then I think a lot of chiropractors rely on the chiropractic radiologist. They look at the image and they say, something doesn't look right, but I have no idea what it is. And so I'm not even going to guess. I'm just going to lean on you to make that decision for me. And so that does seem to be a tough world to navigate and a lot of responsibility to take as a radiologist.
Yeah. And I think all of us are more than happy to do that. I mean, when I look at a finding, more often than not, like I can just say what it is. So I would say on the whole, my job is extremely satisfying, but there's those few cases that kind of linger in your mind where you're like, did I interpret that correctly? Did I make the right recommendation? Should I have not recommended anything? Maybe I'm overcalling this. Maybe I shouldn't be saying clinically correlate these things. Maybe I should be recommending more specific tests and follow up. So yeah, it's definitely a minority of cases, but just as with anything, really, it's a minority of kind of frustrating things in our daily lives that weigh on our mind. But yeah, on the whole, like I would say, going through the training that chiropractic radiologists go through, we come out the other side feeling fairly objective and confident about interpreting images, especially of the spine and extremities, which are our specialty. And yeah, it's a very satisfying thing to be able to have someone send you a film and be uncertain, or have the patient be uncertain, and kind of either put their mind at ease if it's a benign finding, hopefully, but then if not, making sure that they're having whatever finding is present on the film be managed as evidence-based and quickly as possible.
For those who are in school now that may be listening to this, are there any recommendations you can give for making that decision to image, as well as look for further imaging when necessary?
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, any imaging should be obtained with the intention of potentially changing the patient's care. So the ideal solution for patients is if they have imaging that it doesn't change their care, because that means nothing's really that bad. So when we get imaging and it's negative, like that's good for the patient, but we definitely shouldn't be ordering imaging when we're looking for something out of interest, but not necessarily out of saying, well, this exam could potentially push us to do something different. So that's kind of the ultimate question we have to ask ourselves, because sometimes like I'll be looking at an x-ray and they'll have some pathology, but if I can diagnose that pathology on the x-ray, I don't necessarily need the advanced imaging, because advanced imaging, although it will give me more information about that pathology, it's not necessarily going to change the treatment of it. So, yeah, so basically it just comes down to when you're ordering an exam, like what am I expecting to learn, and could this push me in a different direction? If the answer is no, then it's probably not a warranted exam. And if the answer is yes, like potentially it is. So like if you're just looking for osteophytes, right? Like how often have osteophytes changed your pattern of care? Because if you see them in a certain location versus another, you could make the argument, well, that's going to push you where to adjust, but hopefully people are adjusting on what they find via their physical exam and palpation and not what they see on the image. So I don't think we should be adjusting based on where we find osteophytes. It's my opinion. And so in those cases, the imaging doesn't really have the potential to change care, because you're gonna treat what you find with your hands, not with your eyes. So that's.
I had a patient recently, and I do locum work, so I fill in different clinics. So this isn't my patient, but so it was the first time I was seeing them, and healthy in general. They were just complaining of headaches and some stiffness, and palpating their neck, it was very stiff. I mean, probably one of the stiffer necks that I've felt.
Sure.
And I was curious, so I asked, "Have you ever had images?" She said no. I said, well, you don't need them, but I'd really be curious to see what's going on in there. So I get the feeling that would not be a good indication for x-ray.
Well, I don't know that that's necessarily true, because you're an experienced clinician and you were feeling something outside of the norm, right? So I think that clinically sometimes those red flags aren't necessarily as objective as we'd like them to be. Like there's not necessarily something specifically to point to saying like, this is something specifically abnormal and I'm going to investigate this finding. But you're saying like, of the Gaussian distribution of necks I've felt, you're on the extreme end of stiffness and presumably something's causing that stiffness. So, I guess if they don't have any other red flags, sure, fine to treat them. But if they're not getting better, and then, that is an abnormal exam finding that, is outside of the spectrum of normal, from what your experience is. So I don't know, that's entirely unjustified to get imaging in those type of patients where they're kind of substantially outside of the norm, because any kind of extreme deviation from normal like that is kind of a red flag in and of itself.
Okay. You're also a very talented medical illustrator, and you've been doing these digital and 3D illustrations. How did that all start?
Thanks. Yeah, it kind of started out of a necessity of having an artistic outlet in residency. So my first year in residency, it's kind of grueling overall, but your first year is especially bad because you kind of have to be beaten down before you can be built back up. And part of the things that I think everyone has when they're feeling like they're incompetent or somehow otherwise deficient, is they have outlets, right? So like whether that be social or artistic or whatnot, and mine tends to be artistic. And but when you're in residency, you don't really have time to have an artistic outlet. So my artistic outlet and then just became, I've always been kind of dabbling in Photoshop. So I had kind of the technology background in using the software to generate the illustrations, but I'd never actually done an illustration. So I just kind of started making diagrams, the thing I was studying. And then, whenever you do those diagrams, and especially when they're medical like that, and you're kind of a newer, younger doctor or student, you're not necessarily certain how accurate that is. So then I would put them online and get people's feedback. And one of the first people's feedback I got was from a guy named Roland Talano, and he's a radiologist who owns a couple different sites. And he was like, "Oh, like you know how to make diagrams? That's really cool. I wonder if you could do a diagram like this." And then he sends me some crazy like Netter style diagram when I had just sent like a line diagram. And then, so the me being the person I am, I was like, well, that's like crazy, but I can't do that. No, but maybe I could. So let me try and figure it out. So I got permission from my wife to go spend $100 buying an illustration tablet, which when you're a poor resident living on peanuts, it's kind of a big expense. But I got it and started playing around with it and realized, yeah, I can't paint that well now, but maybe I could with some practice. So and with anything, like a small amount of time investment over a long period of time results in quite a substantial change in your skill level. So so just over the years, I've kind of honed the craft and still like learning massive amounts all the time about illustration. But it just kind of all came out of having to need an artistic outlet, and then kind of getting then the social interaction and benefit of interacting with people who are using and requesting diagrams.
I'm browsing on Radiopedia, which, by the way, is I think one of the greatest resources for students as well as clinicians on all things radiology, and it has grown over the years. I first heard about it when I was in school, and now it's really become useful. And for the listeners, you can go and look up Dr. Skalski's profile there and find all of the images. One here on diffuse axonal injury, one on a diagram of the talus. Really high quality, and they do resemble Netter's illustrations.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, whenever I get compared to Netter, it's kind of like butterflies. When you're someone that you look to as like an idol almost. Like every person goes through school and uses that textbook, and we just kind of, and that's the standard reference. Like we don't even think about it. It's like, oh, I need to look up a piece of anatomy. Let's go look at Netter. And so to be compared to that level of success and esteem is very flattering. Certainly my body of work just pales in comparison to his, and I'm not sure it will ever be as big as his because he was a full-time illustrator for the majority of his life. But even just the artistic side of it, I mean, he was a great artist. And and it's interesting because I don't really consider myself an artist per se. I know a lot of people would say I am, and I guess at some level I have to accept that I am because I am making art. But there's a difference. Someone made a quote to me once, and I'm trying to remember it now, is that there is a difference between being an artist and being or an artisan and being a craftsman, right? So a craftsman is extremely good at what they do, but they're not necessarily creating something new or conveying an idea that hasn't been thought before, and that's artistry, I think. So I think a lot of what I do is I'm really good at moving pixels around in Photoshop. And I think that's part of the craftsman. Like I'm very good at the craft of Photoshop. And every once in a while I'll have an artistic thought and I'll do something artistic with a medical diagram. But on the whole, I feel like I'm really just being a craftsman. I'm mastering a software and I'm using it to convey anatomy. And anatomy, anatomy is anatomy. It's not a lot of room for artistic interpretation. And so I think the majority of what I do is being a craftsman. It's not necessarily being an artist, but definitely having the ability to determine lighting and color, because obviously color I use liberally in illustrations like cartilage isn't blue. And I always make it blue so it stands out next to the bone because cartilage is actually not that different color from bone, and things like that. So yeah, there's definitely an artistic component to what I do. And it's flattering for people to appreciate the artistry of my work. But it is kind of interesting when you're just doing it for kind of these utilitarian purposes. Like I want to teach this piece of anatomy. I'm going to make a diagram to show it. My mindset going into it isn't that artistic, but the artistry just kind of happens by the nature of what it is.
Well, much of it is utilitarian, but some of it is just downright fun. And
yeah,
I did browse a little bit just for your name and came across a little Etsy shop. Do you mind if I mention that?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
And you've got some illustrations here of stormtrooper X-rays, and other illustrations of baby announcements, which are very anatomically correct. So I think that one's very very fun as well. But not only that, I remember about a month ago, or I guess we're still in April, the beginning of the month, Radiopedia had an article. And I have to imagine that you were involved in this.
Yeah. You're talking about the April Fool's joke, yeah?
Yeah, the April Fool's joke. The internet is going crazy over these Apple Eye X-rays.
Yeah. So when I started with Radiopedia, because of my Photoshop skills, they kind of they had done 1 year previously of the April Fool's joke, which they actually got me on, embarrassingly. I'm very gullible. They kind of asked me like, "Hey, you want to do the April Fool's this year?" And I think at that point it wasn't quite so huge as it is now. So I whipped something up, and then it was really popular. And of course, there was dialogue that happens, and people are like, "Okay, change this, do this." And when those people are like world-renowned experts in their field, it tends to be pretty convincing. But yeah, these Apple Eye X-ray ones was interesting. I didn't have a lot of time this year because we just had a baby, and I kind of put it off the last minute.
Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I was trying to think of things I could do quickly with minimal time investment, and I was like, well, I could just add a piece of hardware on imaging. And so we kind of brainstorming what to do. And I don't know if you've seen the show Black Mirror, but they have an episode where they have eye implants and they can play back their lives and stuff, and it becomes controversial. And so they kind of tackled that concept, and I was like, well, like let's make people think this is real. And so we're like, well, how could we make this funny? Because it should ultimately, like, people should get a laugh out of this. So like, yeah, well, let's slap an Apple logo on it. Like, it's a pretty recognizable thing, and satire is protected under a copyright. So and then we previously, when we had done them, we upload that, we do a case that's just like here's a case study. Look at this image. It's an interesting case that we can learn from. And this one we did more as like a blog post. Like, we wanted to pretend that there was some slip up that a radiology resident posted this on social media, and then everyone on Twitter was going crazy. So I made up fake tweets in Photoshop of the different editors, and I just kind of made up fake names. And one of the editors, it's funny because among the editors, our favorite thing about that whole write-up was the tweet by Henry K. Smith, because his name is his real name. He's one of the managing editors for Radiopedia, is Henry Knipe, and you actually pronounce the K. So it's not a silent
Oh, really?
K.
Oh,
yeah. So it's a joke, because it's like, why do you pronounce the K? And so I just made it K. Smith, just a joke, and everyone got a kick out of that. So it's pretty fun. This year, I think we only got like 500,000 hits on Facebook this year, which sounds like a lot, but last year we got over 5 million.
Really?
Yeah. So I don't know if we're going to continue with the blog post format and maybe go back to the regular case, or I have a secret idea I'm not going to divulge here for next year's April Fools, which hopefully will get the numbers back up, because I feel bad when people are missing out on this kind of event of being fooled on one day a year in something very nerdy like this.
I think it's become more of a hobby to see who gets fooled by these things.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly posted this everywhere.
Oh, did you?
Well, I mean, I'm a huge Apple fan. My wife gets on me all the time. And anything with Apple and X-ray, I mean, I'm going to click on it. And it's a nod to the real story back probably 3 or 4 years ago, when Apple's new iPhone, I believe it was I want to say it was like the Model 4, 4S, that was found in a bar. And so photos were posted of it. This is the new design, and this is all the tech specs. And
I remember that, yeah.
But also, it is really fun with all the names. You've got Frank Glioblasman.
Yeah, like, so glioblastoma, he's a neuroradiologist, yeah.
Andrea DICOM, DICOM, the imaging reading software that you can get. And Jeremy Jejunum.
yeah, he's a peds radiologist, so he does a lot of abdominal stuff.
And you got tweeted by Donald Trump, apparently.
Yeah. We, the most famous bad tweeter of all time, so you had to throw that in there.
Yeah, that was really hilarious.
Thanks. Yeah, I was the first tweet, I think, in that blog, and it's my name. It says Matthew Sealskin, because Apple corrects Skalski to Sealskin. So. Oh,
I was wondering what that was about. Yeah.
Yeah. That's why that one is, because oftentimes when my wife sends me something from her phone or iPad, she'll say, like, sign it off Melissa Skalski, and it always gets changed to Melissa Sealskin.
Sealskin. Well, that's great. It's a good inside joke there.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw last year's April Fools. We got a little bit of kickback from, especially me, from chiropractors, because it was criticizing the paleo diet, which was kind of the point of it. We wanted the rage, so we got it.
Yeah, the rage is what sells online oftentimes. I'm sure I saw it, but I'm not recalling it right now. So
so it was we called it paleo-induced mineral periostitis. So it was these kind of like little tangential or perpendicular projections of periosteal new bone, which look like kind of like spines on a cactus in someone's hand. And so
yes.
yeah,
Okay.
so it was like, oh, these kind of people want to eat like Neolithic people, and they're eating rocks or they're doing something weird. And so yeah, I it's funny because when we do these cases, like oftentimes I'll come up with the idea and I'll do like a SketchUp of it and say, I think this would be like an attractive social media post. And then we kind of work on the backstory. And so I'll often write what I think the backstory should be. And then usually the backstory that wins out is one of our managing editors named Andrew Dixon. He's a pretty hilarious guy. He'll usually take over and say something way funnier than anyone else. And so we tend to go with that. But yeah, so my initial story with that one was that people were like confused about Paleolithic man and thought they had gizzards or something, and so they're eating rocks to digest grains with their gizzard or something like that, and that's why all these minerals were depositing in their periosteum, causing this like cactus hand type of appearance. I can't recall specifically what we went with, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't that.
Yeah, cactus disease, Paleoindian mineral periostitis, and you have images of cave drawings with cuevas de las manos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we always like to give some type of historical reference. So the year before, we had a Da Vinci painting that I modified to match the pathology and things like that.
That's excellent. I love it.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, it helps sells it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it is just realistic enough to get people to think that it might be true.
Yeah, we always want people by the end of, if they read the case discussion, we want by the end of it to then be pretty sure it's an April Fool's joke, and then all of the links linked to something April Fool's if you click on them. So we try to kind of start semi-convincing and then get progressively more ridiculous as it goes on.
Well, I don't want to take up all your time, but I do want to talk about a few things that may interest students in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Radiology is, for many people, one of the more difficult to study in chiropractic school. What tips can you give for students when they're studying radiology, how to get the most out of it and how to understand the images the best?
Yeah, it's a big question, and certainly one that we need to think about. And it, by nature, radiology is a visual thing, so visual learners have an advantage. And so certainly, people who aren't visual learners or don't learn best visually they struggle quite a bit. And with radiology, when we're interpreting images, so maybe the lab side of radiology in chiropractic school, it really comes down to volume. So the more x-rays you look at, the better you're going to be looking at x-rays. So looking at a lot of images helps. So resources like Radiopedia, Learning Radiology, there's a few other ones out there. Getting on those and saying like I misinterpret this pathology every time, I'm going to go look at 50 cases of that. That's something I think that everyone should be doing who can't extrapolate from like one image to the next, who need that extra volume. And even people who are good at it, because really our confidence comes down to our experience. So the more experience you have, the more confident you're going to be making those decisions. And so that's kind of like the interpretation side of it. But then kind of more the academic side of it is, making flashcards, just the usual strategies, because it's a lot of volume. And so I think that part of the problem people struggle with in chiropractic school in general is because it's such an extensive curriculum in such a short period of time. It's just a ton of volume. So you have to be really diligent about making sure you're organized and have dedicated time to sit down and memorize things, because there's a lot of memorization in radiology, because it's just a lot, there's a ton of anatomy you have to know that maybe you haven't thought about since anatomy class. Maybe there's some new anatomy that you didn't learn in anatomy class. And then there's all of the imaging terms that are specific to imaging, and just spending time with those words and familiarizing yourself with them is kind of a critical thing. So I think people often fall into the trap of thinking of it like other courses where maybe the information isn't quite so foreign, and so they don't necessarily need to spend as much time as they really need. So sitting down with the material and identifying your areas of deficiency and your deficits in cognition are something that's important, because we often, with other things, we often have like a very diverse background of experiences in our life that we can pull from to help us kind of solidify knowledge and, form connections between things and make it the threshold of committing them to memory a little less, because they're related to these other things we have experience with. And radiology is just foreign enough that often isn't the case for people. So it definitely does demand a little bit more of a time investment from a studying standpoint when you don't have experiences that you can tie to what you're learning.
One of the things that I've found is very helpful is self-quizzing. And so that's looking at images when you don't necessarily know what it is.
Yeah.
And when I would use Radiopedia, I believe, I'm curious if this has changed, but you would choose, say, fibrodysplasia or whatever the type of lesion you're looking for would be, and you could find a whole playlist, and so it would find all the cases with that diagnosis, and you could cycle through them.
Yeah.
But is there a way to do that, or to mix, say, certain similar diagnoses together to be able to go through them and quiz yourself?
Yeah, so there's a couple different options. So the quiz mode is kind of a mode that will just select random cases and you can specify a category or something, but it's not super well organized because it's just an algorithm. So finding a playlist that someone has created, like a user-defined playlist, is often best. And if one doesn't exist that fits your needs, creating your own. So there is then you are creating the playlist, so you know what's in it. So then you have to make it either long enough or not look at it long enough to forget what's in that playlist before you quiz yourself with it. But yeah, definitely, like I did that a lot as a resident, and I think this is only my second term teaching at Palmer, so I've been kind of just keeping my head above water. But once I have a little bit of surplus time, I want to create a bunch of these playlists for people to be able to go through and self-quiz themselves, because definitely I agree with you. That is the best form of learning, because you make a decision about the image, and then you find out if you're right or wrong. And then if you're wrong, you can reflect on what led you to that incorrect conclusion. So yeah, anyone can create a playlist on Radiopedia. So you can just create an account. You don't have to do anything on the site if you don't have anything to contribute or anything like that. But anyone can create an account and begin collecting cases into a playlist. So let me just go over here on my computer and open up Radiopedia to make sure I'm saying how to go about this correctly. So I'm just going to open up a random case. Oh, it's osteochondroma. Look at that. So if you click on add to, so in the top right of every case, there's an add to button, and then you can add it to a playlist. And so you can add it to a new playlist or one that exists. And so you can just go through and look at different cases and find them via articles or just via the search bar, add them to a playlist, and then you can progress through that playlist kind of in the quiz mode format by just going to your playlist. So that's the people who are going to take the time to do that are going to be so far ahead of everyone else that yeah, it's definitely going to result in not only a better grade in the course, but certainly being a more competent clinician and interpreter of images. And but that takes time, right? So if you don't have that time, it becomes difficult. That's, I think, what a lot of people run into, is that they're pulled in a lot of different directions with their time, and time is kind of a fixed, ever disappearing thing. So it's just prioritizing your time and making sure that you are giving time that you need to master the subject. Because one interesting podcast or TED Talk, I don't know if you watch many TED Talks, but I tend to try and watch a couple a week, and I watched this really super interesting one about mastery, right? So we talk about like mastering a subject, and the one of the really good points that this TED speaker said was that given enough time, nearly 100% of people could master nearly 100% of topics. So like math, for example, was the example he gave. Like, people think I'm either good at math or I'm not good at math, and I have no potential to master this. But if you think of like language, for example, and reading and writing, in the early like 19th century, if you would have asked someone like, what percentage of people do you think can learn to read? Like, they would have said like maybe 10%, like reading was a rare thing. And it was considered like for the elite. And once we decided as a society that reading and writing was something that we should master, and kind of forced everyone to learn it, everyone did learn it, right? So like nearly 100% of people can read and write now. And not everyone learns it at the same rate, of course, but by the time, we reach, early adolescence, basically everyone can read and write. And I think radiology is the same way. Like 100% of people can become excellent radiologists. It's just whether or not they set themselves up and give themselves enough time to do it.
Dr. Skalski, for those students who may be interested in radiology, any words of advice to them pursuing that diplomate or the residency training?
Yeah. So the main thing of people the advice I give people who want to pursue radiology is, you have to be passionate about it. You can't just, so your motivation for doing it has to be that you're passionate about radiology, and you have to want it bad enough that you're willing to make sacrifices for it, because it is a big sacrifice. It requires so much of your time for such an extended period of time, more than chiropractic school, that you kind of have to push aside other priorities. So your priority can't be elsewhere. So you can't have like family priorities or these other things distracting you, because the time that is required just won't be there. You have to, it just like we were just talking about, it really comes down to time. And so, if you are passionate about enough to make the sacrifice of time, then definitely pursue it. And you're going to have to move for most places, unless your school has a residency program. And so often part of that dedication has to be willing to relocate. And some places that's easier than others. Moving to LA from being a Midwestern kid wasn't easy for me, because my cost of living went up dramatically, and my income as a resident wasn't dramatically higher. So there are other sacrifices even besides time, that need to be considered. So, but yeah, if you look at those things and say, I'm willing to make that sacrifice, then yeah, you're passionate enough and you can be successful, I think. So that's my main thing, is just having a little self-reflection in where your priorities are, and what's your ultimate goal. So like if you do going into radiology residency, if your ultimate goal is like sports chiropractic, well, maybe you would be better served by a sports chiropractic residency, because certainly the sports residents where I did my residency did rotations with us, so they got a fair amount of imaging. So I think just knowing what your priorities are, where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years, and being very objective about what your goals in life are, is going to be the most important thing. But then, so say you decide to pursue it, what's the next step? Well, making sure you've mastered what you cover in chiropractic school, because you have to have that base level of knowledge going into residency, because you're going to be responsible for teaching chiropractic students, among other things, or interpreting images and things like that. So preparing for interviews is something that's important, making sure that all of the knowledge you gain in chiropractic school is working knowledge, and making sure that you're presenting yourself in a way that you convey that passion when you're in your interview process, I think are all important things.
And I should have brought it up earlier, but you not only did your residency in Southern California, but you also did a one-year research fellowship at the University of Southern California.
Yeah. So when you start your residency at SCU, you also begin a rotation for 4 hours every Friday at the LA County Hospital, which is staffed by USC radiologists. And that's an amazing experience, because you get to spend 4 hours in a hospital in a working reading room, watching them interpret everything from the rheumatology clinic to the ER, orthopedic, post-surgical follow-up. And so you get this extremely rich experience. And I think that's one of the benefits of the residency there, that maybe isn't necessarily the experience that you get at all the residencies. Certainly all residencies have their strengths and weaknesses, but that is like a huge unparalleled strength in that residency. And I was fortunate enough in my time in that rotation to get to know some of the radiologists there. And because of my medical illustration background, they wanted to involve me in some of the research they did, and that kind of just led to those relationships kind of blossoming. And through those relationships, I was able to secure a research fellowship position there. Which was a year long, so it was like all musculoskeletal MRI, and I was then at the Keck Hospital instead of the county hospital for the most part. It was an unpaid position, unfortunately, so I had to live a year without salary, which I was fortunate enough to be able to do because my wife's a saint. But yeah, so that was a really good experience. Definitely improved my ability to interpret musculoskeletal MRI, and all MRI for that matter. And then also, having a better understanding of procedures, the different decision-making process for different surgeries, because as part of that fellowship, you do rotations, not necessarily rotations, but you have conferences with other specialties. So every Tuesday morning, we would have this thing called tumor board, where we'd get together with the orthopedic oncologists and the med oncologists and the radiation oncologists and all of this big heterogeneous group of people, and discuss the challenging cases that week. What the surgical approaches were, what different diagnostic methods need to be done pre-surgically, all of these kind of different considerations. How are they going to be radiated afterwards? What complications are going to be expected? What are the goals of treatment? All of these things that aren't necessarily something that we think about in chiropractic a lot, but often our patients are thinking about it. And I think that definitely improved my ability to have those conversations.
If my sources are correct, this fellowship that you did, this was the first time there's been a chiropractic radiologist in that position. Is that right?
At that institution, yeah, there's been a number of chiropractic radiologists who did a fellowship with in San Diego with Donald Resnick at UC San Diego. And so certainly I'm not the first person to do this. I don't know how similar my experience was to theirs or how different. But yeah, it's definitely not a common thing. Only a tiny percentage of even DACBRs, which are a small field to begin with, have done this. The more common fellowship that DACBRs do is an ultrasound fellowship. So there's some formal ultrasound fellowships like at Logan Chiropractic College. It's where you spend a year instead of doing MRI, you're doing ultrasound. And so I think that's probably a little bit more relevant to the daily practice of a chiropractor because ultrasound is more accessible, it's cheaper, right? So an ultrasound unit is going to run you like $20,000 to $30,000 for a musculoskeletal unit versus multi-million dollars for an MRI. And certainly, like we look at MRIs a lot because patients bring them to us and they're getting these MRIs done. But being able to do an ultrasound exam in your clinic when you own the equipment and interpret it there is of huge benefit. So I think one of the people I know doing this, Aaron Welk, he works in a chiropractic clinic and he's ultrasounding people all day long. And the benefit of ultrasound is that it is a cross-sectional imaging modality that gives us some resolution of the soft tissues and the ability to diagnose them when we couldn't otherwise. But then it's also a dynamic exam. So a lot of the complaints we see in chiropractic aren't necessarily static anatomic deformities that we can see on our static modalities, right? So like MRI typically isn't a dynamic modality. We're not doing movement of the patient, kind of trying to reproduce the symptoms while we're doing the exam, which is one of the limitations of it. But when we're doing ultrasound, like say, for example, like you have a popping in your elbow and you can put the ultrasound probe there and see like, is your ulnar nerve snapping over your medial epicondyle, things like that. So it's a much more functional chiropractic practical type of exam, I think. So I think that's going to become, as we move forward, probably a very popular thing within the DACBR community and chiropractic as a whole is using diagnostic ultrasound to help our patients and figure out what's going on with them.
I've been paying attention to this a little bit lately because this is the diagnostic musculoskeletal ultrasound, which is different than, say, what a pregnant mother would go get to view the fetus. But it's being used more widely. The Olympics now, I think they just came out with the paper where they're using it, the Olympic team. And recently saw a couple devices that you can just buy online and connect to your phone. And so you not sure if that's diagnostic quality, but again, just the portability of it. So you can have this mobile device that pairs with your cell phone or iPad, and you can view the image right there as you're working with the patient.
Yeah, certainly the portability of ultrasound is of huge benefit for sideline diagnosis, bedside diagnosis, or just in your clinic. And I know there are some limitations to those more kind of iPhone hookup units. I'm not sure all of what those are. I'm not a fellowship trained sonographer like some of my colleagues are, who could speak to that more thoroughly than I could. But definitely those things are out there and presumably are being used. And I'm not sure exactly what the musculoskeletal applications are for it or how good they are. But it'd be interesting to see how those type of technologies are going to change practice going forward and even our scope as a profession, because I think having X-ray available to us was a huge benefit to the profession. And I think going forward, ultrasound is going to be kind of the next major revolution in our scope of practice and using that to diagnose musculoskeletal disorders and then go on to treat those and show that we're actually making change, right? So ultrasound kind of correlation with treatment change, I think, will be an interesting avenue of research in the future of chiropractic.
Well, you've certainly had an amazing journey so far. I'm looking forward to see more great things come from you. If you were to do it all over again, do you think you'd choose the same path?
Yeah, I don't think there's a single day that I regret what I do. I'm fortunate enough to be able to like wake up every morning and be happy to go to my job. And if I wasn't going to go to my job, I would still want to be doing that job. Certainly when I have free time, I'm doing radiology things like Radiopedia now, because I'm no longer using it so much as an avenue for broadening my knowledge base, but contributing to the world's resource of learning online. And I enjoy education. I enjoy radiology, and I think that's something that passion has grown stronger, if anything, throughout my short time now as a radiologist. So I don't think there's nothing I look back on and regret doing. In my background, I love chiropractic. I'm glad I'm in this field, and I'm glad I'm in the radiology field. And I kind of have like I think I have the best job on earth. So I don't know that many people can say that.
If students would like to find out more about you, where can they find you online?
So yeah, I have a couple different websites. I have my personal website, which is mskalski.com, that has a link to my t-shirts and has some of my medical illustration stuff when people want to pay me to do illustrations. I've done some work from chiropractors doing like 3D modeling and kind of more video type stuff, showing different postural exercises and whatnot. And so some of that stuff's in there. My photography is on my personal website. So if you want to look at some of my photography landscape work, you can find it on there. The clinic actually at Southern California University Health Sciences is like, they bought a bunch of my art. So I feel like when I walk in there, it's my own private art gallery that I got paid for.
Oh, that's awesome.
So yeah, so that was a really cool feeling. And so that stuff's on my personal website, mskalski.com, no period or hyphen or anything, just M and then SKALSKI.com. My practice website is skalskiradiology.com. And so that's where people can sign up to be clients and get my opinion on their images. And usually I try and turn around images within 24 hours. So if you need to read, I'm willing to do it and take your money. and so those are my two websites. And yeah, that's a majority of my website stuff. I do have a Twitter page. If anyone wants to follow me, I tweet radiology stuff mostly. Every once in a while I'll retweet some sci-fi stuff. But yeah, that's my Twitter handle is Doc Skalski. So at Doc Skalski. And then, there's no way to really subscribe to me on Radiopedia, but you can always keep an eye on there and see what I'm doing. To find my profile, if you just scroll to the bottom of the Radiopedia page, you can find a tiny little link in the bottom right-hand corner that says editors. And so if you click on there, I'm one of the senior editors for the site. So I'm in the fourth row down. So then if you go to view my profile, you can see the cases I've submitted, the illustrations I've done. So yeah, that's my presence online.
It's been great talking to you. I'll have links to all of those places to find you in the show notes so that students can start following you and learn more about radiology. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. Oh
yeah, thanks so much. It's been great.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. All right. If you ever want to talk again, I'm more than happy to chat.
Yeah, I think I could go for hours with you. There's so many things.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, no, I know. I feel like we talked too much about me. I'd like to know more about you.
Yeah, sure. I mean,
you have an interesting background as well.
Yeah, though starting to feel like I haven't put any of it to use just yet.
So you mostly locum around the Portland area?
Yeah, I have been for now.
Yeah,
I did the master's in sports medicine at UWS.
Okay.
And so I would kind of prefer that, but I just haven't found a good practice.
Sure.
And now we're going to move.
Right. That's probably a good thing.
Yeah. I think it'll be okay. There might be a few more opportunities in Spearfish, and there's a larger town called Rapid City nearby.
Okay.
That's about 60, 70,000. I have a background in ballroom dance, actually.
Oh, really?
And so,
wow.
Yeah, and so kind of the sports or dance medicine is
that's an
where I'd
interesting
like
niche.
to focus.
Mm-hmm.
Though I'm honestly finding that patient interaction isn't my favorite thing. It's not what I'm really good at.
Sure.
Depending, I'm just trying to narrow that down, kind of finding out what type of patients do I feel energized with? Because a lot of times at the end of the day, I'm just worn out and I'm just done. There's a few times when maybe it is more athletic type person or younger teenager, something like that,
Mm-hmm.
that I do quite enjoy it. But I'm very introverted, despite doing a podcast like this, I have control over it. I can pick one person to talk to at a time.
Yep.
Yeah,
and you have control over the final product, and you can spend time editing it and whatnot. Yeah. What do you use to edit, by the way? I was going to ask you that.
Yeah, so I started with GarageBand. I've played with a few other things. Now I'm using something called Hindenburg.
Okay.
Which is just Hindenburg, like the blimp.
Right. Yep.
Or the Zeppelin. It's built for audio journalism, and so it's kind of the type of thing that shows like the NPR or other things like that. They have I think 2 different licenses, and one is specifically for podcast.
Okay.
Oriented towards podcast or other type of journalism like that. So that's what I'm using now. I'd love to play with Logic, but I just haven't shelled out the money. Or, like you said, I haven't got permission from my wife yet.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it kind of, those family financial decisions are important.
Yeah.
I use.
So I'm trying to. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I use Adobe Audition because I have the Creative Cloud, so it's just part of my subscription. So that's usually what I use. I haven't used it enough to really be great at it, but it's pretty powerful from my experience so far.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the more popular ones. I have a beef with Adobe. I just don't like Adobe.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, I started playing on Photoshop. I think it was version 4.
Okay.
Back in the 90s with an old, it wasn't even the Power PC. This was like the 68K Macintosh.
Okay.
So I dabbled with that. I played with some other things, and I don't know. I think just the whole Flash thing, Adobe Flash, and some other things just kind of got me peeved at them. So I try to avoid Adobe products, although I think they are very good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially for video, like Premiere. There's no substitute for Adobe Premiere, or Photoshop really. But definitely. I'm kind of the same way with Apple, actually.
Oh, really? So you're kind of the opposite of me. That's so interesting.
Yeah. I avoid Apple like the plague, but now Windows 10 has been destroying my life, so I'm becoming less anti-Apple.
Yeah, it's a changing landscape. I've used Windows up until about Windows Vista, I want to say, maybe Windows 7.
Okay.
Use it fairly regularly, and I don't like it. I feel sick when I'm in that environment.
I'm the same way. I'm the same way with Apple. I feel like it's making too many decisions for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's starting to get that way. I'm not as much of a fanboy anymore, but I definitely was in the past. Yeah.
Yeah, but, definitely the leadership has changed the direction of the company.
Yeah, it sure has. Yeah,
it's amazing how one man can make such a difference for a company. Like usually CEOs are kind of figureheads and they're making some strategic decisions, but I remember reading this one article and they were talking about how involved Steve Jobs was in like the tiny details even. So like apparently when they were launching iTunes the first time, like he would come down to the programmers and like tell them to like move buttons to different places, even sometimes as like little as like a pixel or 2. And like he really got into like the nitty gritty of his products. And he was involved at all levels of the product design. And I'm not sure that type of culture has persisted. Yeah,
I don't think it has. Pieces of it are there.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But yeah, I do use Final Cut and was using Aperture. I did quite a bit of photography as well.
Yeah.
Then kind of had to let it go when I was in school, just because so many of these hobbies can just drag you down in a good way, definitely. But also, just time constraints.
Yeah.
But yeah, the one purchase my wife did just authorize was I went for a mirrorless camera, so I got the Panasonic G8 V.
Yeah, those are getting really popular.
Yeah, and partially because I wanted to do more video. So I'm actually going to start doing a little more video for not so much for the podcast, but kind of the YouTube channel that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I didn't even know you had a YouTube channel. I'll subscribe to you. Let me go find it. What is it?
Yeah. And so that it's just exploring chiropractic. I need to stop this broadcast.